3 of the world's major religions trace back to one man, who the Bible says was named Abraham. However, skeptics allege there is not enough evidence to suggest this man ever existed, or even if he did exist, the stories about him in Genesis are probably later embellished legends. Does the account of Abraham correlate to a real time in history, or is the account of him just another later fabrication? If you add up the dates in the Bible, Abraham would have existed in the early Bronze Age, sometimes also referred to as the Intermediate Bronze Age. However, Craig Olson notes there are numerous difficulties with placing Abraham back this far, because several things Genesis records would contradict what the archaeological record says about this time period. However, as we noted in our video on Genesis 5, Abraham and the ages of his immediate descendants seem to be idealized formulas and probably do not reflect their actual ages. Olson also notes there are a few indications in Genesis that Abraham did not actually live to be 175, like that he didn't think people past the age of 100 could have children, which would contradict the idea that Terah fathered him at age 130. Even more damning for this theory is that it is based on the Masoretic reading of Exodus 12:40, which says the people of Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years. In the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek Septuagint, it says the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt and Canaan was 430 years. Paul also seems to confirm this in Galatians, when he says that the law of Moses came 430 years after the promise was made to Abraham. If the Exodus happened between 1450 and 1400 BC, which we will cover in an upcoming video, this would actually place Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age. 430 is also probably rounded up for symbolic purposes, meaning Abraham could have even lived in the 18th century BC, and I don't think that would change much. Now, when we look at the evidence for Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age, we find the account of Genesis correlates well with the customs, laws, and archaeological sites from this time period, strengthening the reliability of the account. To begin with, some skeptics assert that the name of Abraham is likely a literary invention, since it means father of many. However, the Hebrew language didn't exist until centuries later, and the names Abram and Abraham might just be Hebraized forms of earlier names. And plus, the names could have helped shape the later language. Furthermore, we have found evidence of the personal name, Abba Rama, from around the 20th century at a city called Dilbat. The name Abu Rahana has been found in execration texts at Saqqara. The same components that make up the name Abram have also been found in Mari, Ebla, Ugarit, and Cyprus. The name Abraham probably is just a Hebraized form of one of these earlier names and would fit with the cultural world of the Middle Bronze Age. Gösta Ahlström says, "These occurrences show that the name Abram is authentic and not completely uncommon among West Semites." Also in Mari texts, we have found the name Laban and Ishmael. Terah, Sereg, and Nahor resemble place names in the region of Haran, and Nahor and Haran are also mentioned in the Mari tablets. So there are several examples of names fitting with the time period of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, Genesis 11 and 12 says Abraham and his family moved out from the city of Ur, which was in the land of Sumer, and they moved north to Haran, before Abraham made the trip to Canaan. This seems odd because Abraham was supposed to be a nomad, yet is connected to cities. But during the Middle Bronze Age, nomadic herders had family connections to cities and would travel hundreds of miles in all directions. Richard Hess notes that the archives in Mari reveal the herders and the citizens of the town were part of larger families. These herders also traveled long distances from home and maintained family ties that stretched hundreds of miles and crossed the city-state borders of that early period. Not only is this true of Jacob and his sons in Genesis 37, but it also describes something of Jacob's earlier life, his connections with his father Isaac in southern Palestine, and his relationship to his uncle Laban in Haran, hundreds of miles to the north. This separation of families was common at Mari. In Genesis, Abraham leaves from Ur and then Haran, and then lives as a nomad, whereas Lot settles in Sodom. Jacob sends Joseph out from his home base to search for his brothers, who have wandered somewhere in the vicinity of Shechem. The lifestyle of living nomadically and still being connected to cities or settlements was common in the Middle Bronze Age, as attested in the Mari texts. Daniel Fleming reviewed several of these documents from Mari and says, as a whole, the Genesis picture of ancestral pastoralism is remarkably plausible in light of the Mari evidence. Another interesting aspect is Abraham at one point wanders down to Egypt. During the Intermediate Bronze Age, Egypt was experiencing something known as the First Intermediate Period, and the evidence suggests the Egyptians tried to keep travelers from Canaan out. However, things changed completely during the later Middle Kingdom of Egypt. A tomb from around 1870 BC shows 37 Asiatics visiting Egypt. In a work known as the Tale of Senuha, Senuha fled to Canaan when Amenhotep I died, around 1944 BC, where he met a tribal pastoralist who had been in Egypt. Trade routes appear to have been open during the Middle Bronze Age, paving a way for Abraham to make the journey. We also have evidence the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom and the later New Kingdom were attracted to and sought out foreign women, which makes Pharaoh's attraction to Sarah plausible. The rationale for going to Egypt to escape a famine also seems plausible. Phillis Saretta notes that centuries earlier, during the Old Kingdom of Egypt, there is a depiction of Asiatics coming to Egypt to escape a famine. It depicts groups of famine-stricken men and women, emaciated and weak. That they are the desert Bedouins seeking food in Egypt during a period of famine is probable. Abraham would have likely followed the same rationale, given that there was a famine in Canaan during his time. However, the famine of Abraham is only mentioned as a brief incident. After he returns to Canaan, he and his descendants seem to prosper for several years before another famine occurs, indicating the famine he experienced was probably only a minor occurrence. Finkelstein and Langgut argue the Middle Bronze Age was more humid than the previous period. But within this time period, there were also 2 points indicating minor droughts, one of which could have been the drought that caused a famine, which would have pushed Abraham into Egypt. Manfred Bietek also notes that during the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian kings had an East Delta residence, which would make more sense in terms of Abraham coming in from the east and meeting with the pharaoh. The pharaoh also used escorts to take Abraham out of the country, and this fits with Egyptian customs. In the Tale of Senuha, escorts are sent to bring Senuha back into the country. The reverse of escorting Abraham out of the country seems to fit with the use of escorts for crossing the border of Egypt. So Abraham's trip to Egypt also seems plausible and fits with the cultural context of the world of the Middle Bronze Age. Within Canaan, the existence of cities and towns mentioned in Genesis also seems to fit with this time period. Finkelstein summarizes the situation. Important biblical sites that are mentioned in the Abraham story, such as Shechem, Beersheba, Hebron, did not yield finds from the Intermediate Bronze Age. These sites were simply not inhabited at this time. However, Finkelstein also notes the existence of cities mentioned in Genesis are attested to in the Middle Bronze Age. We have found evidence of Laish and Shechem. Bethel, Hebron, and Gerar appear to have been occupied as well. Kathleen Kenyon states that the evidence of occupation at Jerusalem only goes back to around 1800 BC. A plausible location for Aya also dates back to the Middle Bronze Age. There is, however, no evidence of a settlement at Beersheba during this time period, but Genesis only refers to it as a group of wells, not a city or established settlement. Thus, the cities that Genesis mentions fit extremely well with the Middle Bronze Age. In Genesis 14, it mentions a coalition of kings that attacked the cities of the plain, which we refer to as Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to 2000 BC, the whole region was ruled by the third dynasty of Ur. A coalition of kings from the area would have been impossible if the kings of Ur were still reigning. However, after this, the ancient Near East broke up into smaller kingdoms, and evidence shows that during the Middle Bronze Age, coalitions between various kings were formed. More interestingly, in Genesis 14, it mentions the king of Elam was involved. There was only one time when Elam engaged in the politics of Mesopotamia, which was during the Middle Bronze Age. It is recorded they sent envoys as far west as Katna. The existence of a coalition of kings is quite plausible within this time period, as the various kings fought for total control of the area before Hammurabi finally succeeded. Abraham's nighttime raid is also plausible in this time period. Raids appear to have been a common practice of warfare. Similar to what we see in Genesis, one text from Mari records that 300 Yemenites have gone to raid the encampment on the bank of the Euphrates. Also, the narrative of Genesis 14 fits with the narrative structure of a text called Yakadamlim, which dates to around the same time period. Both begin with the first raid or war, and one side being made a vassal, followed by a revolt, and then the vassal being subdued again. Genesis then includes Abraham's victory. Then it's followed by religious ceremonies and tithes. So the account of Genesis 14 fits extremely well with the Middle Bronze Age, just before the reign of Hammurabi. Genesis 15 continues the account and records a covenantal ceremony between Abraham and God, and has correlations to this same time period, instead of it matching the structure of later texts, like what we see in Jeremiah 34. Richard Hess notes a similar custom was found at the Bronze Age city of Alalak. The texts found there were written in the Old Babylonian script. One of these tablets describes the swearing of an oath and involves a ritual, not unlike that of Genesis 15. Wiseman's publication of this text, AT 456, led to the view that it preserves evidence for a covenant-making ceremony in the early 2nd millennium BC, West Semitic culture of Alalak. Genesis also records that the patriarchs made 4 treaties during their lives, and they have striking similarities to treaties from the same time period that had been found at the sites of Mari and Tel Leilan, and not so much to treaties found in later time periods. The treaties begin with declaring the gods as witnesses, followed by the swearing of an oath, stipulations, a ceremonial act, and then curses. Victor Matthews also notes the difficulties faced by Abraham and Isaac in dealing with Abimelech of Gerar provide one of the best comparisons to the administrative text from Mari. Negotiation of water rights and the problems associated with the transient populations are quite clear. In terms of customs, the account of Abraham also fits with the Middle Bronze Age, and not entirely with later Israelite customs found in the Mosaic Law. Most notably is the practice of a ceremony of an heir by proxy. Sarah, Rachel, and Leah provide their handmaidens for their husbands in order to have offspring. Parallels can be found in other texts from the city of Nuzi from about the same time period. They record instances of a wife who was unable to provide a child, so she would offer a slave or a servant to create an heir for her and her husband. Now, some skeptics, like Finkelstein, Thomas Thompson, and Van Seters, have argued this practice is also found in later times during the Iron Age, and doesn't necessarily correlate to the Middle Bronze Age. However, Kenneth Kitchen and Richard Hess note that the skeptics have glossed over notable differences in the examples they pull from later time periods, and they don't parallel to the biblical account, like the texts from Nuzi do from the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Hess says, the 12th century BCE Egyptian text that Van Seters finds as a parallel is a list of unusual adoptions, not normal ones. The 7th century BCE Assyrian marriage document says nothing about inheritance. the female slave may be sold off at will. For Thompson, the Newsy parallel does not mention barrenness and is a legal contract, fromGenesis. However, the parallel is a husband having a child by another woman when his wife is unable to bear children. Further, Late Bronze Age Alalak text number 93 exemplifies a condition where barrenness establishes a legal requirement to conceive by another woman. Behind such laws lies the importance attached to families and to inheritance rights. So this custom, as recorded in Genesis, best fits with the Bronze Age and not the later Iron Age. Earlier in Genesis, Abraham says his heir was Eleazar of Damascus, since he still had no children of his own. Parallel texts from this time period can be found at Babylon and Mari and speak of adopted heirs. In Genesis 23, Abraham negotiates the purchase of a cave to bury Sarah from a Hittite who owned the land. Abraham said he only wanted the cave, which would have been economically pragmatic, since in Hittite law, owning all the land would incur tax, but not if he just owned the cave. Hess notes that Ugarit, Newsy, and Alalak, the special inheritance of the firstborn, could be legally transferred, which is seen in the Genesis narratives with Abraham and Eliezer, Jacob and Esau, Joseph over Reuben, and Ephraim instead of Manasseh. At Newsy, a custom is spoken of where an heir is adopted and marries the daughter of the adopter. This seems to correlate with the account of Jacob, where Laban accepts him as his own and allows him to marry his daughters. Also at Newsy is a custom of a woman being adopted with the condition she be married by the adopter's son. Interestingly enough, both Abraham and Isaac tend to call their wives their sisters. We also see that household idols were seen as proof of ownership of one's inheritance. This might explain why that when Jacob fled Laban, his wife Rachel took the idols to secure the inheritance of Laban's land, as this would assure it passed to her husband and her family. At Newsy, the same phrase we find in Genesis, of their father consuming our money, refers to withholding a dowry, and would explain why she took the idols. Finally, Richard Hess and other scholars note there are distinct features of Genesis that do not match later Israelite practices and themes, thus indicating the accounts of Genesis contain features that would not support the later Israelite goals or customs. First, Genesis 12-50 reports nothing on the destruction of pagan idols or altars, which was a very important issue later during the periods of monarchy. There is also no contest between Yahweh and the pagan gods, like we see later. Their role in the Promised Land is not to purify it of any of those already occupying it. The Genesis narratives would not have helped the biblical authors in their quest to end pagan worship. Abraham was also a foreigner in the land, which would not support their claim that they had a right to rule Canaan. We also see no mention of the god Baal, or later gods that threatened the monolatry of Yahweh. This fits more with an earlier time period, before Baal was exalted to the position of Most High in Canaanite religions. And it also would not help later Israelite authors who were trying to end Baal worship in Israel. Also, we see things in Genesis that would have been counterproductive for the later Israelites. Abraham and his descendants worship in a manner that includes mention of trees and pillars where Abraham placed altars, but not of prescribed places of worship or of Sabbath or food laws. So basically, Abraham does not promote dietary laws and worships in a way that was not allowed in later times within Israelite culture. Their moral behavior also doesn't really help promote Mosaic laws. In fact, there is also a lack of ritual purity and holiness in the patriarchal narratives. Jacob marries two sisters. Judah and Simeon marry Canaanites, and Joseph marries an Egyptian, all of which was condemned in Mosaic law. Both Isaac and Jacob give a larger inheritance to a younger son, something also frowned upon in the Mosaic law. Joseph had a cup which he used for divination, which was directly outlawed later in Deuteronomy. Walter Moberly says, if patriarchal religion corresponds to some kind of historical reality, then presumably this is either some form of a genuinely ancient, pre-Yahwehistic religion, or something that was an unorthodox strand within Yahwehistic religion prior to Josiah's reforms. The difficulty with the latter suggestion is precisely the complete lack of that holiness and exclusiveness, which is one of the most fundamental characteristics of Yahwehism. So the account of Abraham fits with a pre-Mosaic time period, before more revelation was revealed to Israel and a new covenant was formulated. Now here's the main point. Individually, none of these points would amount to much. However, combined, they form a strong case the Genesis narrative of Abraham and his descendants are historically accurate accounts. If you are a Jew living in the Iron Age or in Babylon, you might get one or two things correct about the Middle Bronze Age, but you're unlikely to get all of these data points correct and then weave them into a coherent narrative. Especially when archives, like what we find in Mari, were buried and lost until the modern era. A Jew in Babylon would not have had access to these documents to construct a legendary narrative of Abraham. The amount of correct information and parallels we find in the Middle Bronze Age strongly indicates that the later authors of Genesis were not constructing a legend, but reporting what was accurately handed down to them. Now, some argue there are anachronisms in the text, which we will deal with in other videos, specifically with regards to camels and the Philistines. However, some argue there are additional anachronisms with regards to place names that would indicate Genesis dates to a later time period. For example, Genesis records that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans, but the Chaldeans were a later group that did not control the area until the Iron Age. But updating language and place names was also a standard practice in the ancient world. For example, there's an updated version of the Tale of Senue that dates to the 13th century BC in Cairo. Within it, the word for sea is updated to Yam, a Semitic loanword that was not used in the Middle Kingdom. The older location of Kedem is replaced with Kadesh. Likewise, the place names and titles in the text of Genesis would be expected to be updated over time without compromising the narratives as a whole. Just like today, we can say the Dutch founded New York, even though they called it New Amsterdam. Thus, given the archaeological data, we have good evidence to trust the narratives of Abraham as real historical accounts and not later legends developed for Israel. However, during the life of Abraham, something cataclysmic happened. Within Canaan, the destruction of several cities occurred. Was this historical? Were Sodom and Gomorrah really destroyed by fire? We will investigate this in another video.